So you read the title. That's right. After a 15-month battle with working my ass down to the bare minimum, day in and day out, being overworked, underpaid, and undervalued, and barely any appreciation to show for or lack thereof recognition for my work, I walked away from my job on September 27th. There were plenty of signs telling me that it was time for me to go. Hit the road, throw in the towel, with or without a plan B. Time after time, I've debated whether I should have quit this particular job, despite being told countless times to hold on to my current, or in my case, now former position until I've gotten the green light. So here I am, back at square one, freshly unemployed 2 months later, and without a plan B. And I'm very unsure of what's next in my life, and making a video might ruin my chances of finding another job because I'm also going to be talking about the days of my final week leading me up to walking off on the job. I'm pretty sure 100% they were glad I was gone and probably won't be too happy if someone happened to come across this video either. Honestly, I couldn't care less because I'm no longer there. But just to be on the safe side, I will not be disclosing or using real names in this video for legal reasons, like for the sake of avoiding defamation. And I guarantee that these guys are lawyered up and stacked with connections, so I'm going to limit myself as much as possible, or filter myself as much as possible. Not to make them look bad in any kind of way, but I'm only speaking from personal experiences and observations. On the days of my final week, I have worked Monday and Tuesday, busting out work like normal and nothing more. However, after I've worked Monday and Tuesday, I decided to skip Wednesday and was told to take off Thursday. So, why may you ask? On Wednesday, I decided to stay home. To be quite frank, I was dead tired and I was not feeling it. Didn't even bother to call anyone and not let them know about my situation. I know this is a no call, no show, of course, and I know that some of you are going to rush into my comments, telling me this plentiful times. Like, I get it. Especially after making so many attempts of other coworkers tried to reach out to me by constantly calling my phone, getting missed calls and messages. I decided to ignore them all. And sure as hell wasn't going to roll with another fake 6-story excuse. Besides playing hooky, I went about my day as usual, getting some tasks done around the house and relaxing and whatnot. I was also dealing with issues with my car. Now, since I was off that day, I've taken the advantage to get it sent off and fixed at a nearby auto repair shop. Thursday morning, I received a text message at about 6:12 a.m. from one of the main co-workers according to the time of text. I was told to stay home due to a hurricane's close approach. And since I was feeling so burnt out from work, I was relieved to have some more spare time off as well. Besides resting up, I picked up my last paycheck, deposited the paycheck over to the ATM since the bank was closed, and picked up my card from Wednesday to pay for the repairs. So then came along Friday, which was my final day. Now, just for the record, I was under the impression that I was not on good terms with the employer, regardless of my efforts. I mean, there are issues I was dealing with prior to walking away, and I had been striking up the courage to speak with them for quite some time. There were days where I've missed the opportunity to do so, and wanted to make sure that Friday morning I would show up early in the hopes of having to sit down and actually speaking with the employer face to face, appropriately discussing my issues to reach an understanding or whatnot. I was in a rush to be at work in no time and to leave as early as possible. Shortly after my arrival, I double checked my items and just to make sure that I've had them with me. Barely had any time to pack my lunchbox besides it only being full of water bottles. Next, I opened up the trunk of my car to find my work shoes and immediately noticed that they were missing. Normally, I would keep my work shoes in my trunk and would rather prefer to wear my Adidas slides, which I'm wearing right now, while driving to and from work, and just to avoid tracking excessive dirt and grass on the floorboards of my car. I remember Thursday where I forgot to place them back in my car when I originally removed all my personal items on Wednesday to have it dropped off at the auto repair shop. I proceeded to walk into the office and somewhat made an attempt to speak with the employer, aka boss, about a possible sit down. Before I got to initiate a sit down, the first thing I said to the employer was, "Hey, I need to go get my shoes." The employer then cut me off mid-statement before I even got the chance to say more. He started berating me about my absence for missing work, obviously. Goes on a brief rant that it doesn't look good on my record and such. Okay, just because I didn't call them or let them know about my situation. Of course, no call, no show. Once I made it back to the shop, just at least a minute before my scheduled time, half of the coworkers finally showed up. The guys in charge, let's call them foremans or crew leads, who are typically there before anyone, doing some last minute maintenance on the tools and whatnot. The employer was busy as well, helping out the other guys, which was pretty clear as day that I wasn't going to get the chance to have a sit down, nor speak with the employer, since that it was way past 7:30, just a few minutes after my second arrival. I was told to hang tight. While waiting, I changed into my work shoes and hung tight, waiting alongside a few coworkers who weren't clocked in either. So, although I barely complained, nor had an issue of holding off, which gives me extra time to adjust my thoughts, plans, and so on, but after you wait for an extensive period of time, it could be unbearable, repeating the same morning routine over and over again. My only issue is with the more you idle around, the physically drained you'll become, the less likely you're motivated to not put in any type of effort. Most of my work days I'm not allowed to clock in. If I'm lucky enough, that's only if we're short on workers, but around this time of year, it was the start of slow season and we were slightly understaffed. After several minutes went by, one of the foremans who were hired not too long ago approached me and a few other guys who weren't on the clock either. He was given orders by the employer, needing at least one person to clock in and to do some work around the shop, clean up and whatnot. So I didn't clock in right away and idled just a few more minutes. This is the part where things get confusing. So 10 to 15 minutes go by, the employer approaches us and reiterates the same thing told by one of the main guys from earlier. He needed one extra person to clock into work. Okay. The employer then walked off as I waited once more. No more than 5 to 6 minutes go by. He approaches us again, this time questioning if we were on the clock. So, to me, it sounds like a no-brainer. I mean, he should have just told all of us to clock in at once. Which didn't make sense, but I took it as he didn't want everyone clocked in yet. Besides the minor confusion, it was just a few minutes before 8 a.m. when I was finally allowed to clock in. Despite the time, there was a bit of a delay just because the other guys still needed more time to finish up maintenance and load up equipment. Before I even got the chance to punch in the clock, I looked at my time card and saw that I was marked down as a no call, no show for Wednesday in abbreviation. Then I've also got another no call, no show for Thursday as well, payday, and of course the day of hurricane impact. There was also a word written off below the no call, no show abbreviation on the Thursday column of my time card. I assumed that someone originally had planned to assign me to show up for work, but then decided to have me off instead. I mean, seriously, on the day of the hurricane. But it doesn't stop there. I was also marked late on that same Friday morning. Regarding me hanging around the workplace, I stood around until I was told to be clocked in about 7:52 a.m., meaning it was approximately 23 minutes since my second arrival after retrieving my work shoes from home. For Wednesday, I completely understand that I was marked down for that particular reason, for not calling in or showing up to work, okay? It was my fault and somewhat tried to own up to it, but I failed to open up about it the way I wanted to. However, I didn't appreciate being marked down on Thursday, especially after I was told to stay home and marked late on Friday, when in fact I have been standing around the shop the whole damn time. Like, this signifies a red flag for me. Mixed emotions. My intuition told me that something wasn't right and I was about to be pushed out of the company. There was something iffy in the air, and just wanted to mention the way I used to vibe with other coworkers was rapidly declining, and I didn't want to leave without hearing the end of it. Meaning that it was possible whether I was on the verge of being fired sooner or later, but I'll jump into that later in the video. I was assigned to work with two other guys. The crew chief, let's call him Monkey Mouth, and his little sidekick right hand, let's call him Shredder. Originally there were supposed to be 3 of us, but however, there was an incident that happened between the employer and another coworker who was sent home due to a disagreement over resolving a technical issue. So we've had a 4th person, another crew lead, main detail guy who joined our crew for that day. Rockets, Florida, gotta love it. I've only worked on 3 properties that day. Once we completed both properties 1 and 2, took an hour lunch break before starting on property 3. Only worked through the first portion of the job site, so I never got even halfway through the work. So what happened? While working alongside the crew members, I just found myself very overwhelmed in those last moments, constantly thinking about that morning incident and past misfortune of events that occurred before. I've also had the notion of quitting prior, but not in the way I've wanted to. After I reached my breaking point, this is where I finally parted my ways. Once I finished a small portion of the work while the other guys were taking the breaks, I walked to the back of the truck, placed the equipment, one of the tools I was using, back onto the rack of the trailer, called for a ride, grabbed my belongings, and then I told the other coworkers to have a good life. I wanted to confront them about the possible workplace politics, but they were going to pretend to be oblivious about it and then deny it, so there was no use for me to waste my breath. With me finally deciding to call it quits and walk off the job site, there was nothing but silence from the other guys, probably shocked as they were looking at each other all confused. Well, at least until I was out of their sight. My ride picked me up, and I headed back to the shop, clocked out, and I told the employer that I couldn't handle it anymore. So this takes me back to the question, how did I know when I was about to be fired? Luckily, I found an article that I came across and had been reading up about it just a few times, which I believe that this is very accurate and definitely sums up everything circulating around my situation when I was still employed there. I'll leave a link in the description below and feel free to read whenever. Number 1, the cold shoulder. The first sign that I knew that I was inevitably about to be fired or replaced was that I was often given the cold shoulder. I never felt like I was a great communicator to begin with, generally speaking, although I was very selective about who I would interact with on the job as well. I could never get a word or two speaking or initiating interactions, especially with interacting with the employer unless if it's work related or asked to work extra hours. I would sometimes compare it to walking on eggshells, if you catch my drift. Most times he could come off as really chilled, laid back at first, but however, there were several occasions where he displayed very condescending and dismissive and overbearing behavior. And on rare occasions, he usually would make smart and insensitive remarks towards you at such a covert level, which is why I would find it somewhat difficult to bring up things when talking to the employer, especially whenever mistakes or mishaps or change of plans occur. Opening up or not speaking when it's necessary are a few factors of why I've always had some issues speaking with him because of it, or pretty much anyone or everyone. And there's a lot of pressure on the job, but I assure you it's widely common in any workplace. You never know when this guy will snap at you. That's only rare, but it depends on the mood. But those last 3 to 4 months were hell. He constantly gave me the cold shoulder, such as talking me down, overlooking my achievements, ignoring my ideas, and not recognizing any of my abilities. Regardless of my efforts, this man was usually unavailable and avoided me at some degree. Number 2, lack of recognition. Guys, believe me when I say that I've been working my ass off day in and day out for this job. You can definitely tell by me having rough skin, so many scars on my face, arms, legs, elbows, and knees. Those days were not guaranteed that I would have made it back home alive because of how dangerous those tasks could become. This job is 90% physical requirement, while 10% was basically paperwork and communication. Communication was primarily phone contact because work was so spread out and divided into teams. I was told that I was one of the best workers by most of the staff there, and worked fairly and pretty much with anyone who I was assigned with, rotating from crew members back to back, whether they liked me or not. People liked working with me, or at least appreciated it. But over time, things started to decline after a few months. I'm pretty sure that the employer was somewhat appreciative of my work, but I think it wasn't enough for him to appreciate. As I explained in the first reason, I'm not a great communicator in general. But I do talk whenever it's necessary. This made me question my morale, where I would frequently catch myself worrying or asking other guys about future evaluation, review, and performances. Though I never got much input from anyone, they would often tell me that everyone talks good about me whenever I ask. And the way that some of these guys would respond sounded very backhanded in a sense. No matter how much effort I would have put in over time, I was overlooked and blatantly snubbed, which we would have these rotations with other coworkers, basically sharing hours, meaning some days you'll be scheduled, others take off. When others are scheduled, you take off work. Favoritism is pretty much alive, and they would decide who they would choose and pick to be on the clock, move up, or promote. But as long as there were other guys who showed up, had more character or confidence than effort, were ahead of you, got paid more than you, and got more time than you, and if you're not being picked, you're probably one of the least favorites. Typically, some of these favorites of the employer didn't last that long and who would often quit or be terminated in a short period of time. Overall, I perceived it as nonsense and in a sneaky way of ridding people who were ideally sought as liability and didn't want to keep you around. Besides that, I was given less hours and productivity at most. I would often be treated as invisible, being less spoken to, and was often ignored by other work peers. It was a coincidence seeing that the employer was always busy with other co-workers, especially when that was around the time when I started to pull back. It was obvious that there were early signs I was being slowly pushed out and eventually replaced. Slow season was to start up soon, which was the start of firing season, I think, which was a coincidence as well. Number 3, exclusion from key meetings. I was always involved in team meetings no matter what, whether it is from discussing opportunities, appropriate dress code, seasonal changes, performance of workflow, and overviewing safety policies. We would have these meetings practically every other month. All of a sudden, I was being excluded from the meetings. Why? The last time I've had a sit down with the employer sometime was back in June about me complaining about not getting reconciled or enough opportunities, which sparked his attention from other coworkers, verbal reports, and concerns. The last time I was in a team meeting was on August 23rd, a month prior to me quitting on the spot. Now, if you guessed it, that's right, firing season. At that point, I was feeling very invisible around everyone, like I said, unless they needed something, either it's work-related or to be used like a pawn. Number 4, micromanagement. It was quite unprecedented if I was truly micromanaged. Besides the fake applause I get from others on several occasions, no matter what I did and how much effort I put into my work. This was not sudden, but was obviously a subtle sign from the get-go that I felt out of place. Going back to the past summer, I remember sometime just signing up on a Saturday, volunteered to pick up some extra hours. When I came in that day, I quickly discovered my name was crossed out. You got a piece of paper where you want to write your name on it and such and such. Going back to the past summer, I remember sometime signing up for a Saturday on a piece of paper, volunteered to pick up some extra hours. Now, when I came in that day, I quickly discovered my name was crossed out on the list. Prior to that, I might have spoofed and complained about it too much to other coworkers and probably went back and told the employer, which might have drawn his attention. And during the sit down, he tried to come up with a linear excuse for the other guys and complain about how hot and tired everyone was because of the weather. And not to mention the poor meals of choice. Had me coming to work because the fewer guys he picked to volunteer never showed up. The employer also stated that he felt like he couldn't trust me, additionally critiquing my flaws and explaining to me that I was lacking confidence, which I was prevented from using or operating certain equipment or wasn't being allowed to drive one of the company trucks. The employer was watching my every move, as he said it himself, according to the final meeting back in August, mentioning in reason number 2, there were some hourly cutbacks. On rare occasions, I was told to stay on call or stay home. I used to wear a plain orange V-shirt at the start, but things suddenly changed around spring this year when I was made to wear a work shirt with the inclusion of the company's phone number design on the back, just so they could probably get calls from clients and could easily know about your whereabouts, and to be potentially spied on by known associates. There were numerous times where I've spotted some of the crew leads or foremans and sometimes the other company associates or the employer showing up on job sites watching you from a distance. There are very few times I'll admit to slipping up or slacking off. But the majority of the time, I usually keep busy for the most part. But that didn't stop the employers or one of his associates pulling up and seeing that you take breaks and would sometimes be misinterpreted. I'm like, I guarantee you. They probably would assume the other and might be thinking that you're taking advantage of their hours or time by milking the money. Number 5, stagnation, decrease in opportunities and growth. The workload I've handled for those last 15 months was slowly beginning to wear on me. And it was quite a surprise that I've lasted a little longer than the first time I left during the pandemic, which was 13 months. Because some of the mistakes I might have made in the past compared to when I left, not only being excluded from past few meetings, seeing less hours, and lack of opportunities. I used to be in charge of driving one of the utility cars before, but all of a sudden it stopped sometime early this year. The majority of my time being there, I would often work alongside the main detail guy. I'd notice whenever he was out for a day or so, instead of me being in charge of the utility cart, I was automatically assigned to other teams to perform low-level tasks compared to the other co-workers, in spite of work rotation. I wasn't driving one of the company trucks, nor I was being trained on new opportunities. Of course, it was an expensive summer for them. They were replacing old equipment with new ones, or what I would prefer to as the company's toys, which were limited use for some workers. I wasn't learning anything new, which might have triggered me in a way and started to seek validation. A way of trying to be heard and felt acknowledged. But I was a fool. In reality, it would backfire. And I was also seen as the go-to guy or the backup guy who was used to doing everyone else's dirty work. Because I was good at it, as some would say. I will also talk about my pay later. So things took a turn as I eventually found myself drenched in constant self-doubt. It was doing the opposite, making me somewhat stagnated. Almost as if there was no way of getting out of my situation. I see coworkers would often interact face-to-face at ease before it was time to roll out. Communication was regularly via phone, calls, and texts. I barely received any calls unless if I'm told to work mandatory shifts or stay at home for the day. Sometimes I would call the other guys, but they hardly ever pick up or answer any of my calls. I also believe there might have possibly been a way out of my situation if I were to bring things up to the employer early during my employment. That may be another reason for them being on the verge of letting me go. I was interacting less and was being distant. I do speculate that the management thought I knew too much about what went on and probably thought I was talking reckless too. Either way, the damage is done. I felt as if I was inadequate. I suffered a tremendous loss of motivation and heading directly towards burnout. I was a complete nobody. I didn't see a reason to stay with the company. Someone or more wanted me out of there for sure. Number 6, the backhanded compliments, undercover insults, and negative feedback. Apart from the start of other issues, and I have to agree that there might have been a few incidents in the past contributed me to being possibly slowly pushed out. My way of workflow, I could best describe it as sort of imbalanced. One day, my workflow can be very effective, and another day, my workflow can be very poor. Sometimes I can be vocal, and most times I would appear to be introspective. And I used to work like a maniac with the help of excessive energy drinks. Being unaware of my actions might have drawn attention to the public, where they would laugh, record, and make negative assumptions or public gossip. Sometimes it would happen to me whenever I would go out in my own hometown. Sometimes calling out of work, which would normally be twice a month. Showing up late sometimes, but not all the time. And being drawn into involuntary conflict. So much for being heckled by panhandlers, lunatics, and Karens. There was a minor motor vehicle incident that occurred last November after I completed a left turn to an oncoming Mustang, rearing the work trailer but leaving no injuries. These are just a few examples to name some of the screw-ups that occurred, and it's undeniably true. Overall, I feel as if the employer was not happy with my performance at all. Thought I was problematic to the company at some point and might have held me accountable for my mistakes and probably wanted to fire me. There were mentions of me from him, like recalling moments where I can where he can be heard on the speaker of another coworker's phone, as I'm overhearing him blurt it out that I might be a screw up. What was also a slap in the face was letting him speak low of me in such condescending ways. I was sometimes made fun of or trash talked by other colleagues because of my interests and hobbies didn't align up with the other guys. There's this thing where people would constantly undermine my intelligence, assuming that I don't know what I'm doing, and always in the need to explain things from point A to point B, as if I don't know anything, looked down on, or sought as incompetent, not only by company staff, but clients or onlookers or other people in general. Unfortunately, I was subjected to a lot of ableism, where I would be told many times that I mumble and I don't speak up enough. And not speaking enough was problematic to them and also subjected to animosity. Number 7, the impossible task, unrealistic expectations and deadlines. I don't necessarily need to bring up any more backhandedness or undercover insults I've endured while on the job. I see almost every other coworker or their newly hired buddies has openly used antics against one another on a regular basis, whether it is from joking, communicating, or clicking with one another. I've worked crazy hours, 10 to 12 hours a day. This is no ordinary landscape company that just sent you out to do just residentials. Major contracts are spread all around town and in nearby cities. I've worked on highways, freeways, public parks, churches, libraries, small businesses, plazas, hotels, the woods, the lakes, ponds, ditches, industrial and governmental facilities. Although there should be some sort of a reward or an appraisal out of the work you do, but no, there isn't. It's just plain old repetition every day. When it came to hard work, I was assigned to do the most difficult tasks ever. At most times, I'm taking busted up equipment, if not limited, that barely functions properly out onto these properties, making it sometimes impossible to complete the list. Equipment is supposed to be reported periodically, but it seems as if no one cares to report them, least at the last minute. People just hand pick the best working tools they see. Then there's this colloquial thing around the company that reeks with the need to constantly blame one another, especially if things don't go right. And if something goes wrong, if your tool somehow stops working, breaks on you, gets lost, or isn't the right fit to do the job, it's automatically your fault. Even if you do right, work was insatiable to upper management. Barely any satisfactory shown for what you do. In my case, I was good at what I did and always found my way around taking on tough jobs and as well as a few problems that came and went. But in the end, I've suffered the bad consequences or a bad case of inadequacy. Upper management was in a cahoots and sure as hell knew what exactly they were doing around the time I was micromanaged. Gaslighting me, saying they love having me around, which was utter complete bullshit. I was being set up for failure in those last months, especially when I was caught on using one of the newer equipments. Ever since then, those guys have had 2 meetings without the lower rank workers, or ground workers, standing around the workplace for unnecessary periods of time, sometimes even longer, having to work in extreme weather such as mowing and rain, dealing with half-ass equipment, riding and dismantle AC trucks. One of them did not have any working windshield wipers. I shit you not. Sometimes with non-working tailgate lights, worn out or failing brakes. Yes, it happened. You're working too fast, you're working too slow, you're not good enough, and assumed to be slacking off, sometimes forced to leave work early, and sometimes forced to work late. No kidding. Number 8, the final straw. The written warning. I was given the written warnings quite a few times, whether it is from calling out twice a month or arriving late or being told to stay on call, aka stay home. Those few times when I arrived at work late were just a few minutes close or after my scheduled time, yet I was written up as late. I'll never forget that one time when the employer lied to the detail guy by telling him I wasn't going to make it to work after when I literally texted him about running late. I did almost have sympathy for the employer as he was in turmoil and was so much under pressure to keep up. But the screw-ups and favoritisms persist beyond my half. Combination between being trapped at a dead-end job and burnout had fallen perfectly in place. With me being excluded from meetings, the private discussions those guys were having, meetings without me, it was clear that they were plotting to get me fired, but didn't know how. And I saw it coming, but I didn't think it was going to be this bad, as I was lying to myself. No matter how many times I say it would get better over and over and over. And then also, I fell into the pit hole where kept bringing my problems to the workplace and couldn't keep it out. I'll admit that I might have overshared too much of my personal life just to make these guys think I wasn't capable enough. Although I had no intent to do that and might have slipped up on it a little tad too much. Not having anything else better to talk about in my life and couldn't truly relate to anyone, as I felt like it was kind of a nuisance to them, and yet another reason for the employer to terminate my employment. I was almost completely isolated. It was a perfect combination to make sure I was out. This wasn't just a test of patience. This was a shit show disaster just to make sure that I was eventually out, then if not, reprimanded and then fired. I guarantee you, besides the written warnings and being written up as late or no call, the whole dirty gimmicks and tactics were part of the final straw too. Now, my thoughts. I've taken so much disrespect so frequently, I was starting to accumulate a negative mindset and a swift change of perception. It was nothing more but dread coming to that place every day. Talking about being off the clock and for prolonged periods of time, hours cut, reduced productivity, decrease of opportunities, to be excluded from meetings and then micromanaged. I felt like I had a valid reason to do what I needed to do, such as calling out, but I didn't think it was going to be this bad. I didn't think I was doing well to a certain extent. Now, perhaps going through stages of mental burnout or mental malfunction. During the second return, or the boomerang effect, I was full of energy and was very optimistic about the future and hoped for possibilities of moving up in the company. Well, those possibilities were long gone before I even knew it. The environment wasn't entirely bad, but there were very few good moments where I've had with some of these coworkers over time. At first, I did find it ideal to go out my way and possibly invest my time in being around others, but on the other hand, I was already taking on my own personal endeavors and wasn't exactly too sure where to fit this social life into my scheduled time because of the hours and my time. Because of my differences as well, whether it's from interests, hobbies, or lifestyles, I felt like as if I couldn't truly click with the majority of them. I've seen quite too far many good workers that came and went. Surprisingly, there were a few good amount of workers I've also gotten to know and held onto their jobs as long as they could. But unfortunately, a good handful of those workers didn't stick around for too long, and you pretty much know how the rest of the story goes. Besides working alongside the good coworkers, there was also came along a bunch of few rotten apples. In spite of working alongside the coworkers, I don't have any means to be judgmental. Some of those guys have had previous troubles in the past, then have not suffered misfortunes or was in a bad spot at some point. A chunk of them surprisingly were not so terrible, but decent people. You wouldn't believe how many times I often would hear colleagues tell me about their life stories or personal fair shares of life. I would often overlook it. I barely judge simply because it's not my time and place to worry about who did what. All I know is that some of those guys have made mistakes and were willing to change their lives for better. But still, that doesn't change the fact that I found most of them to be pretty shady, and I can't help to say it. I prefer to stay in my lane, but you can believe it or not. I didn't really find myself in much conflict with other coworkers, but it's not feasible to avoid. Anyone is likely to encounter conflict at any workplace at any time, whether it's voluntary or involuntary. There are very few moments where I would find to be annoying, where I'm constantly landing money to someone, then being given short change in return, or they couldn't pay me back. Being mooshed on to buy someone's lunch, buy them Polar Pop soda. Sometimes I'm giving up cigarettes all the time because people don't want to buy their own. Doing things for other coworkers felt like I was obligated to do so in order to compensate validation and acceptance. Being too nice had also came with a high price of being subjected to being a pushover, backstabbing, and gossip. At some point, I was near conflict when I was doing some side work at the shop. After a long day of detail work, I was helping out by dumping tree debris onto one big pile from the crew cab dump truck, while others were pressure washing the other work trucks. As I was finishing up in the crew cab, another coworker decided to close the cab over gate before I even got the chance to step out of it, then act as if he didn't notice. Then started smacking his teeth when I addressed him about that, because they think they could easily start problems with me and get away with it without any consequences. There was another coworker instigating, which didn't even make my situation better. I'll never forget when one of his hoodlum friends made a foul move by deciding to leave a fucking dent on the side of my car. I immediately spotted the dent between the driver door and the headlight of my car. It caught my eye when I pulled up into the shop riding along with the main detail guy one evening before clocking out. Happened back in June. My only way of knowing was there was a guy, thankfully he didn't stay long, gave me an attitude when I asked him a non-invasive question regarding the workload, previously assuming I was going to have problems with this dirtbag, believing he might have been the culprit of doing so. Bottom line, co-workers are not your friends, unless if it's beneficial to them or pick up the slack of other teams to do their work. Now, just a week or two after I left, I happened to run into one of my former co-workers, or Shredder, who owed money to another co-worker who was recently hired not too long ago either. He owed him some money. So I gave the new guy a lift, which he happens to live close in my neighborhood. As I gave him a lift over to where we pulled up on Shredder, I spoke to Shredder for a bit as he returned payment of what he owed to the other guy. Shredder had asked me a question, and of course, why did I quit? I told him I was burned out and wanted to move on. He recommended talking to the employer about my situation, but then I told him I'm never coming back, and I will be gone for good. I believe I was going to be let go regardless of negotiating another comeback. I blurted it out to him, believing that I was being spied on or micromanaged. Shredder also did bring up or mention what I've said to him. While working on property 3, I told him that I was being watched and he might have thought I was triggered and quit. Then said Monkey Mouth tried to blame him for it. I didn't really tell Shredder what exactly went down, though, but I suspect that he was in on it too and played along with Monkey Mouth. Shredder was part of the key meetings too, was to become a main crew lead or foreman as well. But I think Shredder wasn't fully aware of what was going on. During those last weeks being there, things have been very secretive, especially between the co-workers and the employer. The phone and face-to-face conversations seemed short and very light, almost as if the interactions I've had with the guys were gradually waning away or dying. As I stated early, everyone would interact or pick and choose to interact with who they want to. But in a way, I see it or would perceive it to be code switching. Generally speaking, I've had a variety of labels placed on me, whether it is from being funny, weird, peculiar, strange, and sometimes insensible, boring, and dull. I would constantly get cut off while speaking and talked over. When isolated, I would hear these guys chuckle and laugh and using dialogues similar to backhand compliments, almost insulting my intelligence at a degree. So, to my knowledge, that only appeared when I was around. Even though some coworkers would easily connect, joke around, and mindlessly watch and scroll through social media content all day. I think that's just a cloak trick to blind me from what's actually going on, and definitely had a lot to do with me being excluded and been given a cold shoulder in the first place. I would literally watch these guys sit in the trucks, either driving, working, or idle. And every time I'm on those properties with them, I would see them from a distance, pull out their phone and point it my way. I've also made a comparison by observing the other crew leads who pretty much repeated the same pattern of behavior. I do believe that I was being documented and they thought I wouldn't notice, sending lengthy Slack messages towards another during those past few weeks. This brings me back to Friday, September 27th. On Property 1, we were cleaning up and mowing once the hurricane had passed, and I was responsible for groundwork, or piling palm fronds, that morning, while Monkey Mouth and Shredder were mowing. I saw Monkey Mouth videoing me. He was close to the building while I was close to the parameter doing work, giving him the ICU expression gesture V sign as I'm onto him. Once work was done with equipment loaded up and ready to move on to the next job on the list, we sat in the truck for a few. Normally, I usually do not like to stare at people's phone screens, but I accidentally happened to catch a glimpse of what would appear to be a Snapchat video on Monkey Mouth's phone, presumably sharing with another, probably a coworker or foreman or the employer. And this was going on as I was sitting in the back right of the truck. He was typing a lengthy message before and after the video. I then used my phone to screenshot the exact same area from the video using Google Maps, matching up from where I was standing opposite of Monkey Mouth's angle of view. Just before the start of Property 2, where Monkey Mouth assigned me to use one of the mowers, rotating with shredder, I saw an old beat up purple spring wrist coil keychain with a single key hanging on the mower's brake handle. I've asked him why it was there. Monkey Mouth literally told me that the brakes needed to hold some weight on it, and the keychain also belonged to another company vehicle, and tried to put the blame on another coworker for misplacing it. Then I quickly removed the keychain off the mower brake as he was chuckling and laughing, and placed it onto the armrest inside the work truck. I wasn't buying his reason, as I suspect he was lying and made up an excuse as a cover-up to set me up, potentially having me under fire. What got me thinking more was that this was probably his way of getting back at me after I flipped him off just a week before over talking trash behind my back. Because he do it a lot, which is why I call him Monkey Mouth. Motherfucker laughs like a monkey. As ridiculous as it sounds, but I sent him a funny dog compilation video on Instagram. I might have gotten a sense of humor wrong of his, but being a bigot he was, not to sound very homophobic, but he might have thought I was a queer or something and probably put a gaydar on me. Again, I'm not homophobic or nothing like that. I think he was trying to test me. Alright, one morning on my way out from the shop, working with detail guy, Monkey Mouth placed his hand on my knee for a brief second before pulling away. I didn't like that shit, so I was 2 inches away of smacking his hand away with the backhand slap, but I missed. Because apparently I'm not a player, or I don't get women. Some of those coworkers would go to great lengths, risking suspension or termination by catcalling pretty much every woman they see on every street turn as we go from one job site to another. Catcalling would occur almost every day and with no shame. And to think that most of these guys have wives or girlfriends who work or stay at home. Therefore, I don't participate in catcalling much because I'm not very attractive and would be labeled a creep. And it's never a good thing. I don't have much of a stable life of my own to call, and to have very little energy to do anything when I was working and being off on those weekends. Let's talk about my pay, because this one hurts the most. With all the hard work I've been doing, a lot of you would be surprised that I wasn't getting paid as much as most people would assume. My paychecks were an estimate between $300 and $500 range weekly. If I'm lucky enough to pick up more hours, I'll be in the 600s. I've only received 2 raises since my second return. 1, after my 90-day probation period had ended, which was last June of last year. And 2, the middle of spring this year. I started at $12.75, and after 3 months, I went from there to a 50-cent raise, which was $13.25. And after breaking my back for a whole year, I've got it bumped up to $14 an hour. Now, to do the math, that was 10 months of work just to get a lousy 75-cent raise in total and a bogus ass $50 bonus check. Finally got my driver's license from last year. Then I bought myself my first official car this year. No, I didn't go to a dealership, but was hooked up by a close relative's friend who offered me to buy the car from him. I thought it would have had less problems than I anticipated. I mean, still, it's fairly old for a 20-year-old car. The job didn't provide benefits besides signing up for an insurance coverage plan sometime in January early this year. Instead of investing my hard-earned tax return to have my molars removed, I bought myself a car. I bought a car costing $3,000, along with racking up over $1.4K in auto repairs, paying fees, and replacing 4 tires for new ones. Costing me damn near $5K in a span of 5 months. What choice did I have? It was either riding an e-bike from point A to point B, or having better transportation, which is not the best, but still take me from point A to point Z. I was originally riding my e-bike from point A to point B, but then I got tired of going from 2 to 3 places and then on my way back home. I'll give an example on my paydays. Whenever I've got paid every week, I would have to make at least 2 or more stops to get where I need to go before heading home. Riding a beaten up e-bike to the closest food market and to catch my paycheck. I've got charged between $9 to $17 of fees depending on my payroll amount just before heading over to the ATM. Normally I would be off so late in summer season where my bank closes around pre-evening and hopefully not to get robbed. If I'm lucky enough to have an early day or a day off, I just head straight over to make a full deposit. Not to mention dealing with some of the bank tellers who were kind and a few who would sometimes covertly mock or make snarky and condescending comments about my wage. On rare occasions, I would get asked regarding if my paycheck was legit, because my withholding amount never stays the same each time I would make a trip. I feared that it might have raised false suspicion or something. Overall, the bank tellers treated me well, which was no big deal. Sometime last year, after my first raise bump, I made a request to the employer if I could turn in a direct deposit slip, but I was eventually denied. Upper management would often say to save money. True in some ways, but obviously they didn't want to pay you right, which is why I never bothered to ask for a raise. It was hard to fire people there no matter what screw-ups you did. I think the whole key trick that Monkey Mouth did would have taken the cake, not only to get me fired, but have gotten me in more serious trouble than that. Buying a car was one long-term goal I wanted to accomplish since day one, and is the original reason why I returned back there. I would swap between riding a bike and driving a car every other day, just to save myself from mental strain for driving too much. I know it sounds like I'm complaining too much here, but I have bills to pay like everyone else does. I have to pay $140 a month for auto insurance. Grocery shopping prices weren't as crazy as last year, now that inflation fell down about 2.4%, but still it's kind of costly. And from where I live, there's no way I could find a better paying job in my area, even if the population in my hometown has increased in numbers in recent years. Overall, staying with this particular company wasn't going to make things better for me in the end. Things were becoming more difficult as it was hard for me to maintain a positive attitude. Like I mentioned before, the damage was done. It was too late. Never saw myself being there on long terms anyways. I did not initially want to return, but only to acquire transportation and put it to use to find better work elsewhere. I don't think some of the guys or the employer entirely gave up on me despite the misadventures, but I've already decided by fate that it was time for me to move on. My body was clearly telling me that I couldn't handle it, and I was growing tired of it. I didn't expect upper management to be as deviant as I anticipated, but yet allowing others to treat me and not speaking when necessarily is a bad ordeal. I've also got word that the same coworker who was sent home called it quits the same day as I did. Hey man, small town man. One more way of knowing that I was being let go was they were rebranding their company. Judging by the new logo design, I saw it on one of the trucks on that final morning. They were seen fixing up things as I was walking out of that place that afternoon. I think the reasons are obvious, just for cutting out negative associations from screw-ups they did, screw-ups other people did, or slave driving you until you quit. Maybe I shouldn't throw that term slave around despite the ratio of employees. There was me and 6 other black guys, 1 Hispanic guy, and 2 white guys during those past few weeks. And don't expect me to participate in playing the race card either. The employer had black co-workers who were favorites of his as well, so race is not my issue. Besides being a house hermit, what I mean by taking up my personal endeavors, you must know that my personality can be incongruent. Days I'm very vocal, and other days I'm very introspective. The things I say hardly ever align or match up with what I do, which can sort of confuse people, potentially raise concerns or bad intentions from others. I believe that there might have been gossip about me that has been spread outside of work, perhaps other parts of town. Like, I live in a small town, but again, besides population increasing, places I might have worked at or who I've worked with or associated with made me a little bit more suspicious and started to question my own reputation. From my observations, others who've been acting rather avoidant and silent whether it is from family, their friends, neighbors, co-workers, and employees from other establishments. I don't know, it's been a term of unpleasantries. I know things and activities I contributed to online in real life, such as changing bio, playlists, deleting social media. People think I'm suspicious. No one said it, but I'm not stupid. Nonverbal cues speaks well for itself. I would find out people were unfriending, unsubbing, and unfollowing me. In real life, people are either laughing, taunting, ignoring, and avoiding me. This caused me panic and went into reset mode. So in return, I've completely wiped out my entire Facebook friends list, deleted my information off there too as well as remove other social media accounts. So roughly 6 months ago, I deactivated my Twitter and because I needed a break, only to discover about a few weeks later, it comes to find out that my Twitter has been permanently deleted. I'm pretty sure that these employees and employers have already seen my YouTube channel, so let it be. And let it also be a goodbye, fuck you letter.